You're listening to Stand Tall and Own It, the podcast for high-performing female leaders who are ready to make an impact by discovering the safety that comes from understanding their own value and exercising their own authority. I'm your host, Andrea Johnson, and I'm here to tell you it is time to just truly be you, my strong friend. It's time to stand tall and own it. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Stand Tall and Own It. I'm Andrea Johnson, the Intentional Optimist, and this is not the episode that I had planned, nor is it the episode I recorded earlier this week. Somehow it's gone. I went to share the audio version with my producer, and when I went to open it up, it was just a gray screen. Now I'm going to re-record that for you because it's information that I want you to have. It's all about the life principles that I talked about 2 episodes ago, the difference between core values and life principles. And I will share with you, it's an overview of intentional optimism. As a matter of fact, I'm probably going to record it right after I finish recording this one. But it's highly ironic because today I'm going to share, and feeling a little odd because I'm all smiley, right? Like I normally am. But I'm going to share an experience that you might be familiar with. And like me, you might not have necessarily acknowledged it or named it. And it's, something that we talk about in certain circles and not in others. But I have a question for you. Have you ever just been kind of, bebopping along in your life and something just stops you in your tracks? For instance, all of a sudden you feel an intense desire to fall into an old soothing habit. Like for me, and I've shared this many times on both interviews that I give and on this podcast, my desire for soothing the eating. And your body might feel really stressed out. You might all of a sudden not be sleeping, and mentally you shut down. You're unable to process. Emotionally, you might be on edge or weepy. And I have a phrase that I use, I say, I have dry powder right now. And if you think back to like a Wile E. Coyote cartoon where he's got gunpowder or something set up and he's got a really long fuse to it and it burns and burns and burns and burns and Bugs Bunny comes by and chops it off and so it doesn't actually explode. Well, when I say dry powder, I mean there is no fuse. It's just powder is there and all you do is you set a match to it and it goes off. And so it's, in other words, it's like a hair trigger kind of explosion. You may feel a need, like your body's in fight or flight. You might need to run away or just hide. Does any of that sound familiar for you? Because if so, it may be that you use the word, and I don't really love this one, but I don't know a better word to use right now. So if you're listening and you have a better word to use for this, please email me or comment and let me know. For lack of a better word, you feel triggered, like your fight or flight is completely activated. Well, in case you haven't figured it out, this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about trauma, hidden trauma, more specifically when you don't realize it's there, or perhaps you thought you dealt with it and suddenly you're feeling all the effects. They might be physical, mental, emotional, but in the spirit of standing tall and owning it, I want to acknowledge the trauma response in my body that I experienced just 24 hours ago and learn together how to walk through it while still moving forward, because nobody wants to experience something like that and stop in their tracks, no matter what it is, stop doing anything that moves us forward. About 2 years ago, maybe I read... I shared at a conference this week that I love to read books and I love personal growth books. And I started a book club with some friends that was supposedly about personal growth books. And now we just pretty much read fiction because one of the books we read in that book club is The Body Keeps the Score by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, MD. And if you've not read it and you're interested in trauma, it is about 3 inches thick and it is not written in big font. It is small. He is the doctor, the psychologist or psychiatrist that pretty much came up with the idea or understood and discovered the effects of PTSD. So he's a little bit like the foremost mind on trauma. So before I get any further into this episode, I do want to put out there this disclaimer, if you will. I'm not an expert. I am not trained. I am not trauma informed as far other than my own personal experience and what I have learned. This episode is not designed to be definitive or even fully educational. The purpose of this episode is to make you aware of the possibility of trauma in your life and the pervasive nature of trauma. It's also to give you some basic information and to please listen to me, encourage you, either with some simple steps that work for me after going through a lot of therapy and a lot of my own personal growth, or to encourage you to seek professional help, because again, I have, and I'll share a little bit of that in just a minute. I don't expect this to be a super long episode. I really just want to put out there that when things like this happen, it may feel like it derails your life, but it doesn't have to. It kind of did for me for about 12 hours or 8 hours, and now I'm back to being able to process things. So let's, of course, I'm going to do this. Let's look at what trauma actually means. The definition of trauma is literally the exact definition is some kind of wound. And if you think about trauma care or an emergency room, it's like, this is the trauma room. And it's when an experience is super stressful for us. It's frightening, distressing, events that are difficult to cope with, especially if they're out of our control. And one of the things I learned from The Body Keeps the Score is that it's especially difficult for us, and we hang on to trauma, our body holds on to trauma longer if whatever happens to us is not resolved, if we're not able to resolve it. So when we look at definitions, it could be an incident, or it could be of trauma, or it could be something that happens over a period of time. For me, I've shared, I'm not going to go into actual details of anything, but I've shared in the past how some of the belief systems that I held, I consider I don't know that they're necessarily trauma, the belief systems themselves, but the effect that they have in my life is a trauma type response. And most of us will experience some kind of event or something like that in our lives that are going to be considered to be traumatic. And you need to understand there are different types. If this is new to you, then this is very high level, right? So trauma can be physical, it can be emotional, mental, spiritual, all kinds of trauma. But what happens to us and what does it look like? What is the aftermath when we are made aware of it? Like sometimes it's very clear. We have a car accident or we fall, or something happens that's very traumatic experience, that's an incident that happens quickly. In the aftermath of that, we may feel a lot of stress, we may feel fear, we may feel anger. It can lead people to find that they're unable to stop thinking about whatever it is. If you mull over something and just continually go over it, they can put you in this really high state of alertness or arousal, like feeling on guard. It reacts, that's when I talk about dry powder. It causes people to react really strongly to certain things. Like when we're talking about something like PTSD, a lot of times a sound or something, or a smell will really, or a sight will really get them. For me, what happened to me yesterday was kind of a culmination of quite a week. Looking back in the aftermath, I can look at that and say, oh, how did I not see this coming? Because let me share some of the psychological symptoms of trauma, and then I'm going to go into kind of what I was feeling and then how it looked for me. Symptoms of psychological trauma are things like shock, denial, and disbelief. Like, oh no, that doesn't really happen, right? And you've heard people say these things. Confusion or difficulty concentrating. Oh, man, I had that a lot this past week. Like, kind of like, what is going on with me? Why can't I think, right? Anger, irritability, mood swings at myself, at others. I broke bad on my son over a washcloth last night, okay? I'm just going to stand tall and own in all of this here, right, folks? Broke bad. And in the moment, I mean, I was literally, my hands were in my hair, just kind of scratching at my head. And I just looked at him. I said, hang with me here. I'm dealing with this. I'm going to get through it. Let's talk about this. Because it's just a washcloth, right? But not really feeling like I had control over that mood swing that was happening. Anxiety and fear is a symptom. Eating is totally one of my coping mechanisms. And I did that a lot this last week. Then, of course, the guilt and the shame or the self-blame. Guilty for my thoughts, guilty for my actions, feeling like I could cause this for myself. Withdrawal from others. I am known for what Bob Goff calls turtling. I just pull all the vital parts inside a shell. And I mean, my dad will even text me or call me and say, I haven't heard from you in a while. What's wrong? Because he knows that's what I do. Sometimes even feelings of sadness or hopelessness and disconnectedness, or numbness. This is kind of how, when I say it came to a head for me yesterday, I can see those things happening earlier in the week, but it came to a head yesterday. And let me tell you what it looked like. It looked like that disconnectedness and numbness. And I was a little surprised at the way I walked through the day. I will share in a second that how I worked through it actually is a result of a lot of the stuff that I've done for the last 10 or 15 years. But what it looked like, other than being disconnected and numb, was I got so negative. Now, I'm the intentional optimist, right? So when I turn negative, not only do I feel like I'm being, off brand, but I also feel like I'm letting people down. So when I get really, really negative, I also feel a lot of shame and a lot of guilt. So what happens is I go inside, and the self-talk that I was giving myself yesterday was so brutal. I was questioning my purpose. I was questioning my business. I was telling myself how old I looked with my gray and white hair. I was telling myself how fat I was. I was literally all of these things. And being able to say, stop, what's going on here and how do I deal with this is incredibly important. But sometimes, and I'll share with you in a minute what I have to do a lot of times when I get there. But in the aftermath of it, waking up this morning, nope, I'm going to share it now. Sorry, I have notes because I'm a little nervous sharing this stuff. The best advice that I can give myself in a situation where my negative talk is that strong is that I have to go to bed. I have to be willing to sleep on it. I have to be willing to say to myself, yes, it's 6:00 and I know that you feel this way about yourself. And in 3 to 4 hours, you're going to go to sleep, and tomorrow morning you're going to wake up and it really is going to look different. I promise. And I tell myself that. And a minimum of 70% or 80% of the time, waking up, like even just taking a deep breath, waking up and dealing with whatever it was in the light of a brand new day makes all the difference. Because half the time what happens is the culmination of that week and then the bodily experience exhausted me. When your body's under that much stress and you're in fight or flight and you're feeling that way, you're exhausted. So that's an encouragement piece. That's a number one thing for me is go to bed and wake up and see what it looks like in the morning. Now, when I can do that, I have access to my tools. When I can wake up the next day and say, well, what happened and what am I dealing with? How do I unpack this? I can now work through it and say, all right, what are my ABCs here? What are the assumptions and beliefs and conditioning that I'm dealing with? I assumed that everything was fine and that there was just something that was off. We have a lot going on right now with family, extended family, and health issues. My son finished his first year of high school, and that's, so we're in the first week out of school, so schedules are off. My husband was out of town. We got some financial stuff going on, some things that have to be done in our house. It's just a lot. And I just assumed that I was okay and that I was just dealing with all of it. But then the things that I believed was I just needed to keep moving and it would all work itself out, which clearly just didn't happen. But this is where the conditioning comes in. I was conditioned to think that I was the problem. I was conditioned, and so I do that, right? So sometimes trauma is part of our conditioning. Sometimes the things that happen to us or that we experience over a long period of time is part of our conditioning, and that's the hardest work because what happens is when you get pressured, that conditioning is what comes to the surface, and that's when you get this trauma response that you may not have been expecting. Ugh, I know, it's a lot, right? So understanding in the light of day, looking back and saying, these are my ABCs. This trauma that I am dealing with that's part of my conditioning. But here's the other piece that I've been working on is that I know my core values. I know what I stand for. They give me a sense of autonomy. They remind me that I am a whole person and that whatever happened or whatever experiences I have or whatever things I had to deal with, I'm still a whole person. They remind me who I am. They give me that sense of purpose back so that I no longer question it, so that I can remember that I get to think for myself. I get to be truly Andrea, and I get to create a sense of belonging, even if it's just me in the circle. I get to do all of those. So that's how understanding my core values in the light of day, I get to review that and it helps me. But the other piece, and this is what next week's episode is going to be on, is those life principles I talked about, the difference between core values and your life principles. For me, that is intentional optimism. And I just joked and said, I'm the intentional optimist. When I get really negative, I feel like I'm letting people down. Well, but let me tell you how I think I'm living out, even in the midst of when everything was coming to a head for me yesterday, how I lived out pieces of intentional optimism. And I'll share more of these in the next episode, but I was courageous. I mean, as soon as I saw what it was, I knew I could not keep silent. I knew I had to share it. And so bless my sweet friends and family who got the verbal vomiting of me being able to share, this is what I'm going through. I think this is what it is. I'm trying to name it and I am going to face it head on. And this is courage, right? This is being willing to do the hard thing. There was an aspect of wisdom, even in the midst of it all coming to a head. I wanted, and I knew I had anxiety and irritability, and I wanted to practice respect and understanding with and for other people. And I had to do that in public spaces and I had to do that in private spaces. And in private spaces, it wasn't quite as good. Breaking bad on my son is not usually a thing that is, something that I would say is wise, but being able to get to a place where I was able to resolve it before we went to bed was very helpful. But the other tenet of intentional optimism that I'd like to pull out here is that as soon as I realized what was going on, I was able to practice being present. My practice being generous with my personal space and time, practice being kind. And so being able to look back now and say, okay, trauma is part of the conditioning and I'm going to deal with that. But here's who I am, my core values, and here's how I'm going to live it out. I did an okay job with that yesterday. A lot of what I dealt with was internal and then I shared it with people. But these are things that really helped me, and these are the things that I can say now. Life may come up. Things are going to go wrong, but this is why I live the way I do. This is why I do what I do. This is why I tell you why I do what I do. How's that for being meta, right? And I'm not telling you that these things are a magical solution that will get you through all your trauma. I'm not, because again, like I said in the disclaimer, I'm not an expert. I am not a professional. I am telling you that the work that I have done and having these things present make each time I deal with a traumatic response in my body and my brain and my heart more productive, more authentic, and more transparent and effective. So each time I work through it a little bit more. You may have other tools in your tool belt or in your toolbox. These are tools that work really well for me. So normally I have a call to action. Normally I invite you to something. And I guess my invitation today would just be that you would be willing to name if you've got something like this going on. If you're having trouble sleeping, let me look back at those symptoms again, okay? If you feel like you're in shock over something, or you feel confused and have difficulty concentrating, if you feel a lot of anger and irritability and mood swings, and if you have anxiety and fear or guilt and shame, I think I even feel many times guilty because I feel like I'm the first person to blame when it comes to what I experienced as trauma. And that's just an immediate red flag. It's like, as soon as somebody says that, it's like, oh, you're experiencing trauma. If you feel like you need to withdraw from others or feel hopeless or disconnected or numb, I just invite you to take a look at these things and then see if you can name it. Because a lot of times naming the trauma is what helps you get it out in the open and start unpacking it and start pulling all the strings or all the spaghetti noodles out. But if you need to, if that's not enough, just begin with acknowledging it and please get some help. I'm not the person that can recommend somebody for you, but there are people in your area, there are people online that can help you with this kind of thing. So please, this doesn't have to be something that holds you back. And I think that's the biggest message, is that even when we have a traumatic experience or a trauma response to something that's in our past, it doesn't hold you back. It just means that, and it doesn't mean that there's anything to be ashamed of. It just means that there's something else for you to grow through and something else for you to learn through and to deal with. I was scrolling through Instagram this morning and I came across a reel where Hugh Jackman was telling Ryan Reynolds how much he admires him for being so open with his anxiety. And they were having a conversation about how it makes it easier to talk to their kids about it, how it's better for men to see somebody like Ryan Reynolds be really open and say, this this is what I deal with sometimes. And it's the same for me. I would love to be in a conversation with Hugh Jackman and Ryan Reynolds, but what I mean by it's the same for me is I want you to see that this needs to be normalized. This needs to be, and everybody says those kinds of words, but I'm somebody who makes optimism an intentional thing in my life, and this is what happened, and this is how I deal with it. So we don't need to necessarily share any of the details of the trauma that we may have in our lives, but acknowledging the presence of it and working through the solutions and toward the solutions together, that's the answer. We're not alone. You got this. I'd love to know if this was helpful to you. I'd love to know what resonated. If you've got a friend who needs to hear this, please share the episode either on YouTube or on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you listen. If this is something that you want me to talk more about and you want me to have conversations with, I can pursue that. I can pursue conversations with some professionals who might be helpful. DM me on Instagram or LinkedIn. I'm happy to have these conversations. You can email me at andrea@theintentionaloptimist.com. I have started sending my newsletter out again, so if you haven't subscribed to that, it can be helpful, and I'll go into a little bit more detail each time on something that I'm working through and that I'm talking about here on the podcast. But if you're on YouTube, of course, subscribe and share. We're getting more and more likes and subscriptions on the YouTube channel, which is really exciting for me. I love to see where people put comments like they do differently. It's different there on YouTube when people leave comments. So here's the deal, folks. This is not something that you need to be ashamed of. Let's stand tall and own it together. And until next time, you got this.